Hi. This video is called Truth, Lies and the Mind's Need to Survive. I want to start with something small, everyday human. My friend, let's call her Julie, didn't reply to my message. That's it. No drama, no catastrophe, just silence. Just silence. And within minutes my mind began writing a script. Maybe they're annoyed, maybe I said something wrong, maybe they've decided they don't want to speak to me anymore, maybe they hate me. The feeling was real, but the story, the interpretation, was entirely invented. Later I found that Julie's phone had simply died. This is the problem. Most of our emotional reality is created long before we have any evidence at all. Today I want to explore how the mind shapes our sense of truth, how it does this to protect us, how we mistake imagination for reality, and how, with clarity and precision, we can begin to see what's actually happening without blaming ourselves for the adaptations that keep us alive. So, our first understanding is that the mind doesn't report reality, it interprets it. Everything we know is interpreted. One of the great misunderstandings is the belief that we perceive reality directly. We don't. We perceive a constructed model built on memory, pattern recognition, emotional associations, survival strategies, and expectations. A whole raft of things we put together and make a so-called reality out of. And we experience this reality as truth. This has been shown by neuroscientist Benjamin Libet, when in 1981 he demonstrated that the brain begins preparing actions several hundred milliseconds before we become conscious of deciding them. We're not the origin of the process, we are the narrator who comes in after the fact. We know not of what happens, we only know of what has happened, albeit by a fraction of a millisecond. We create a false narrative when we attempt to explain decisions we did not even fully choose. We didn't understand them, we didn't know they happened before we were consciously aware of them. Again, Spinoza understood this way back in the 17th century. He wrote that everything in the mind serves the conatus, that drive to persist, survive, organise and make sense of the world. In modern terms, this means that the brain doesn't care if something is true. It cares if it helps us stay alive, stable and oriented. So when Julie doesn't reply to my message, my mind instantly builds a narrative around offence, abandonment, and I start to build internal hatred. I'll talk about internal hatred more in another video, but anyway, it's not irrational, it's adaptive. If silence once meant danger, rejection or humiliation in early life, the brain learns to detect it as a threat now, not because we're weak, but because the organism remembers everything and it uses it to create structures later. So our poor brains prefer a story over uncertainty. It's part of the survival mechanism. Uncertainty is scary, even scarier than a known threat, that rustle in the trees. Our mind tells us it's a tiger, better a tiger than a monster who hid under your bed as a child. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who along with Gerd Gigerenzer happen to be my favourite psychologists, in their infinite wisdom found that humans experience uncertainty as more stressful than being wrong. The brain would rather invent a coherent lie than sit inside the unknown. The absence of information is intolerable, so the mind fills the gap. Silence becomes meaning, ambiguity becomes a false narrative, emotions become evidence of danger, and by the time consciousness catches up, it feels like the truth. Here I guess we need to talk about forced memory research. In controlled studies in the 1970s and 1980s, Elizabeth Loftus was able to implant entirely false memories in participants. Stories of events that never happened, simply by suggesting them and emotionally reinforcing them. She demonstrated this repeatedly. In the study, some people were asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? and others were asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Those that heard the word smashed, which implies a more severe collision, were influenced, and in their recollections of the event, they estimated higher speeds by the car when compared to those who heard the word hit. Later, the participants were asked if they'd seen broken glass at the scene, even though no broken glass was present in the slides. She found that the participants exposed to the misleading information were more likely to report seeing things that were not present, such as broken glass after the accident. This is why an account of an accident may be inaccurate. We assemble our recollection of events from what we know already, or are primed with. So our brains are plastic and easily manipulated by external influences. Participants in her study didn't think they might remember them. They became certain they did. This is how powerful interpretation is. Memory isn't a file we retrieve. It's an experience the brain reconstructs every single time. And every reconstruction is shaped by what keeps us safe. The emotional brain speaks first, before reason even gets onto the plate. Neuroscience shows that when we're under stress, the amygdala, the emotional alarm centre, reacts before the rational prefrontal cortex comes online. This is why you can feel rejected without any evidence of being rejected. It's not a failure of character. It is the order in which the nervous system processes experience. The body reacts, the mind explains the reaction through our existing interpretations. And then we believe the explanation. Complicated? Yup. How about some real-world examples? We see this everywhere. Studies published in Psychological Science show that eyewitness testimonies, even from confident witnesses, is often wrong because the brain rebuilds what it thinks it saw based on an emotional state and expectation. The Mandela effect, large groups of people remembering something that never happened. Not stupidity, collective recollection, reconstruction. Placebo and nocebo effects. Expectation alone changes our pain, physiology, immune response and healing rate. The brain doesn't just interpret reality, it modulates it. So now for the practical shift. How do we navigate this? Not through blame, not through guilt, not through forcing ourselves to think differently and change, because the organism evolved this way for a reason. Instead, we begin with observation, without interpretation. Ask yourself, what am I experiencing before I explain it? This is the foundation of realism and the practice that we undertake. First, we separate the three layers. What happened externally, what I felt internally, what I told myself about what happened. Most people live with all three collapsed into one experience. For example, your boyfriend doesn't return your call. He didn't reply, therefore he doesn't care. When you separate them, clarity returns. Next, expect the mind to invent something, not because you're irrational, but because you're human. When you see this happening in real time, the intensity begins to dissolve, and eventually it just becomes humorous. You're sitting there watching it. You are no longer part of it. Spinoza wrote, "We are free when we understand, not free from emotion, free from being ruled by the stories we attach to emotion. The feeling is real, but the meaning is optional." The moment the narrative breaks is the most transformative moment in human development. It's not the moment of awakening, the moment of success, or the moment of insight. It is the moment you catch yourself narrating a story as if it were fact. That is the beginning of mastery. Not just psychological mastery, but ontological maturity. So as always, let's talk about the practice now. This is why. In mentoring and in practice, we begin with sensation, attention, the body, and the immediate physical present. Because when you return to what is real now, the imagined interpretation loses its authority over you. The story collapses and reality remains. And life becomes a lot simpler, cleaner and more stable. In closing, I'll offer you this. Next time someone doesn't reply, someone looks away, someone pauses before speaking, someone shifts tone, someone falls silent, ask yourself, what do I feel? What happened? What am I adding to this? Not with judgment, with curiosity. Your mind is not lying maliciously. It's making meaning in the best way it knows, based on everything it has learned while trying to keep you alive thus far. But with practice, with observation, with realism, you can begin to see the story forming before it becomes the truth you live inside. You can begin to see the story forming before it becomes the truth you live inside. And that is the beginning of freedom.